Welcome back to Seek Strength. Someone recently just asked a question on, do you ever need to do technique blocks for powerlifting? And I thought this is quite an interesting question because for pretty much every other sport in the world, we will spend a lot of time fine tuning technique, technically in the absence of progression. So we'll spend a lot of times practicing a technique that is very, very specific and repeating that as much as possible. So we might be spend time swinging a golf club, we might spend time practicing submission, throwing a ball, kicking a ball, practicing a particular stroke, any number of different sports. We will spend time with these specific techniques, repeating them over and over in the absence of increased fatigue, like we might think of in terms of powerlifting. So the idea here, or the implication here from this question, is, do we ever spend time where we literally just practice technique as much as possible? The answer to this is no. In short, the answer is no, you don't need to do this. Now, you could technically do this if you want to, but it wouldn't actually benefit you to a huge amount. First of all, you don't relatively simple. The learning curve for them is quite short. You can learn very passable, a very good squat, bench, and deadlift technique potentially in your first session, certainly within the first few weeks. And if you're relatively talented, if you have enough mobility and you're not absolutely fucked up from a load of different injuries, you can actually learn a squat, bench, and deadlift technique that will stick with you for quite a long way into your career. Now, this will change naturally or unnaturally as your muscle mass increases, as your body weight changes, and as injuries accrue or leave you. Your technique will change and you'll obviously get a little bit more particular proprioception with these movements, but by and large, the movement could look quite similar if you have good quality coaching from the start. Now, the technique might not be easy to implement, but it is quite simple compared to the fine tuning we need when we're swinging a golf club, or the fine tuning we need when we're going for a heavy snatch or a particular stride length. We can get away with a little bit more brute force on the squat, bench, and deadlift. But what's very, very interesting about the squat, bench, and deadlift is that while we're doing our training block, while we're in our high volume phase, while we're in our medium kind of intensity and moderately high volume, we can actually improve our technical aspects because the large portion of them should be well ingrained as you're practicing them. You can literally change a large portion of your technique in the middle of a set, let alone set for set, week from week. You can start off a relatively untrained training block in powerlifting, and by the end you can have largely improved technique while improving your weights. So there's simply no reason to do this. You could do this if you needed to or if you really wanted to, but there's no actual need to do this because you can improve it while training. So you would largely just be wasting a large amount of time in training where you spend time with technique, and eventually you'll still have to do that higher volume phase. So the implication here is that if you do that technical block, it's a moderate volume, quite low weights, maybe very, very low weights, you're probably getting detrained, or you're likely losing a little bit of progress. You're probably losing a little bit of muscle mass, and you're essentially just waiting until you need to do that higher volume phase, whereby you could do that high volume phase and improve your technique, or rather fine tune that technique as you're going through them. A lot of times when we're coaching our powerlifters or going through the powerlifters in our Facebook group, as they move through their powerlifting blocks and you make technical changes, you can make these technical changes as the weights get heavier. Which brings us to the second point in the question, is that technically in powerlifting is quite unique, and weightlifting is similar, is that in weightlifting and powerlifting, we don't technically get sport-specific training at the technique we want until we get to these heavier weights, most of the time in excess of 90% for both of them. So when I'm swinging a golf club, the golf ball is never going to change in weight. I'm never going to change my position, or I'll always know what golf club I'm using, and I'll certainly know what golf club I'm using on the game day in most parts, so I can practice with that as much as possible. I'll know that ball is the same place, I'll know it's the same weight, and I'll know the golf club is the same place, and I can put myself in the same position every time and repeat that sport-specific activity. However, technique at these heavier weights for powerlifting is actually quite different, and we never actually get 100% sport specificity until we do comp day or until we go max out our lifts at the appropriate time. So these lighter weights and these kind of 70, 80, 90 or sub 90% weights do facilitate a technique, and they let us practice a technique that we hope we can use onto heavier weights. But until we get to those heavier weights, we're not technically practicing the sport of powerlifting, which is one repetition max squat, bench, and deadlift. And until you do those lifts at the appropriate time, you don't actually get sport-specific movement of powerlifting trained. So you could be wasting time not only in progression, but you could actually be wasting time in that you're not actually getting major technical training unless you're very, very inexperienced. For a very, very advanced lifter, someone who's been lifting maybe 6+ years, a decade or more, a technique block isn't really going to change something unless there's massive changes to be done, because only when you get to those heavier weights will you be able to practice the specific technique of the heavier weights. That said, you'll notice I said the appropriate time to practice them, or appropriate time to go for heavy weights. This leads us then in the opposite direction, is that some powerlifters and some coaches have taken it to the degree where they think you always need to be doing heavy singles. Now, this can work sometimes, but we would argue that largely it's not needed. We actually would argue that most of the time you're wasting training fatigue. So on the other side of the thing, where we're doing really light technical work and we're wasting our time doing training that's not progressing us, on the other side of the coin, if you're always doing heavy singles in the squat, bench and deadlift, you're actually wasting a lot of fatigue that would be more valuable put into just the volume you need to get done for the day. Now, some lifters say, oh, I couldn't do my doubles or my sets of 5 or whatever unless I did that top single, and there's this implication that you might be using post-activation potentiation on the strength lifts. Now, there's no good evidence for the use of PAP or any form of potentiation on heavier lifts. For lighter lifts, or there isn't of yet, and experience will tell you you're probably just wasting energy and psychological resources you get to those heavier weights. Now, leading up to a peaking block, this thing makes sense, but some lifters will make the mistake of doing this from the get-go. So let's be clear. How much are you actually wasting if you go for these heavier lifts or these heavy singles? So a lot of times people will do a smarter aspect, so they might be going for 160 5x5 and they'll do 180 for a single, even though their max might be 220. In that case, you're not wasting a whole lot of work, so it doesn't really matter. We're not here to start a lynching of people who do programming in that particular aspect. But what does cause an issue is when people go for all-out maxes and then drop back in training. So you're definitely getting a lot more central nervous system fatigue there. You're opening yourself up for tissues or soft tissue or ligaments that aren't able for those loads just yet because you haven't facilitated that through more volume at lighter weights. Psychologically, you're taking a lot of effort going for these heavy singles all the time, and you're just wasting energy you could be putting in to these moderate sets and reps. Now, if you're doing this heavy single method 3 or 4 weeks out from a peaking, maybe that might make sense. Maybe that might be a useful way of practicing singles, as oftentimes people can get very good at repetitions, and in that scenario it might make perfect sense. But if you're doing it 16 weeks out from your training block, I think you're mostly stroking your ego and not really training as you should do in terms of getting out your own way. Ultimately, though, people are their own lifters and they can train however they want to. We don't particularly think it's a good style of programming, but we know some people do like doing it. So again, at the end of the day, it's what makes you happy, but we don't recommend it. Outside of that, we don't recommend a technique block unless you're absolute shit. Unless you're dog shit at lifting, then you might need to improve things. But as many as you know, you can improve your technique as your block progresses, as you do your volume. If you have any questions, please let us know below and be happy to answer them. I love answering questions, and I love getting questions that are phrased in a way that I'd never really thought about before.